It's absolutely my privilege to introduce you to Anjali Lal Gupta. She teaches journalism at Sarojini Naidu School of Arts and Communication, University of Hyderabad. She was also a journalist for over 16 years in TV, digital media, and development communications. Over to you, Anjali.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm really excited to moderate this session on timeless tales. Really delighted to have two panelists here, Vayu and Anuja. I will read out their introductions. Vayu Naidu is a performance storyteller, founder, artistic director, and storyteller of the Vayu Naidu Intercultural Storytelling Theatre Company Limited. Chair of the Black British Theatre Archives and Professor of Practice at SOAS in the School of Arts. She has a PhD in the epic and oral traditions of Ramayana and Mahabharata from the University of Leeds. Her writing, short stories, novels, children's books, radio plays draws on the oral traditions of storytelling. Her novels include Sita's Ascent, 2013, nominated for the Commonwealth Book Award, and The Sari of Surya Vilas, 2017. Her latest book was released in 2024, The Living Legend, Ramayana Tales from Far and Near, which especially delves into the strength of relationships with nature that Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana make to restore balance in life. Great to have you, Vayu, here. Yeah. Anuja Chandramouli is a best-selling author and New Age Indian classicist. She has published 14 books across mythology, historical fiction, and fantasy genres. Her debut novel, Arjuna, Saga of a Pandava Warrior Prince, was among Amazon India's top 5 sellers in 2012. Her Mohini, the Enchantress, was awarded the Times of India Author Award in 2021. She's a trained Bharatanatyam dancer, TEDx speaker, storyteller, content creator, and columnist for the New Indian Express. Anuja's latest book that came out in 2024, The Wife and the Dancing Girl, is a retelling of the Tamil classic Ilango Adigal's Silappatikaram, and is receiving rave reviews. Welcome to both of you to Hyderabad Literary Festival. So to begin with, I'd ask a very basic question, which is what draws you to this genre of retelling Indian mythological tales, especially since these classics are so beloved to so many Indians. And some writers would say these epics have been told in a grand manner, on a massive scale already. What more can be added to these tales? They would feel daunted by the prospect of going back to these classics. But here are two writers. I want to ask, what draws you to this genre? Yeah.
Thank you, Anjali, and my lovely co-writer. We will be more coexistential in our responses, which is lovely and not confrontational. Can everybody hear me? This was a bit of a sound check as well. It's a lovely title of a panel about timeless tales. I'll be brief, and when you asked what makes one write this, I currently live across two worlds. Many of us are global, even those of us who live across and in India. I live in London and I live on the Bay of Bengal between Chennai and Mamallapuram. Many have said you can take Vayu out of India, but you can't take India out of her. And that's very much what happens when you're an intellectual diaspora. I live somewhere else, but I'm also reminded so much because I can recollect and visualize clearly the India that's been physically left behind, but the India that every Indian takes in their heart across any ocean. There's a certain responsibility when you take on the reimagining or retelling of an epic, and those little hooks will come out through what we're saying. For me, it was not that, oh, we have a large number of diaspora in India, Australia, across in different parts of Africa. It was really understanding how does that thinking, which was part of an Indian civilization through the many Ramayanas that have been written, what is it saying and how is it significant across the world in our time today?
Hi everyone, I'm so happy to be on this very lovely panel. To answer your question, Anjali, it's very simple. I fell in love with these stories. It's a very straightforward love story, and I'm very fickle in my head. My interests change every second, but this is eternal. I will always love the stories, and when it comes to Indian mythology, it's ours. You know, there's a certain possessiveness about it. It has the comfort and nourishment of a home-cooked meal. And one of my earliest memories, I was only 2 at the time, I must have been only 2. My grandmom used to tell me the story of baby Krishna. And even then I was a morbid kid with a violent streak, I guess. So my grandmom, she'd pulled no punches. She'd describe how Kamsa lifted up the babies by their feet and dashed their brains out. So I'm like a gog and my eyes will go big, and you know, I could repeat it verbatim, just the way she used to say it. So whenever she had guests, she would show me off. She'll make me sit on the table and I had to entertain her guests with the story of baby Krishna. And that was the first time, you know, when you're a kid, there's no BS. So you know when you own the audience. And they're all clapping for you. And that's where this love story began. And I love these characters. I respect them so much. And I just wanted to be a part of this oral storytelling tradition that has been responsible for giving us this legacy, this inherited treasure trove of stories.
Yeah, you want to add something? Yeah. So just a sort of an addition to that question. Do you feel a little sort of apprehensive about, you know, these are not your general, usual fantasy genres. These are sacred books. The main characters of these books, these texts are worshipped. So do you feel sort of apprehensive about touching them, about exploring their inner lives, and to also come at parts that are not, let's say, too laudable? So how do you manage in anticipation the sensitivities that might come? Some people would say, these are our deities, these are our gods, please don't go near them, right? So how do you justify retellings and reimaginations of old classics when you have such a large population of the Indian subcontinent worshipping these characters?
I want to answer from the Indian perspective, and I'll put it
Okay. So for me, again, it's very simple. It all, the respect and reverence I have for the gods, the divinities, it comes from a place of love and affection. So there's a level of comfort and familiarity with these gods and goddesses, you know, and not to take anything away from, not to disrespect anyone's beliefs, but the way I see it, it's the classic chicken and egg question. Did God create man, or did man create God? You can argue both ways, right? So I love that my equation, I mentioned Krishna already. So Krishna for me, more than seeing him as Krishna from the place of reverence and awe, he's my childhood imaginary buddy. When I was a kid, I had this wild imagination, pretty well-behaved kid, but I couldn't sleep at night terrors. And my mom was very particular that 8 o'clock is bedtime, whether you like it or not, lights off. And I'll call and tell her, I'm scared, there are monsters under the bed. And she'll point, she was a overworked woman, so she'll point to a picture of baby Krishna, which we had in the bedroom, and she'll say, Krishna is there. So go to sleep. He'll look after everything. So when I couldn't sleep, you talk to baby Krishna, and I spent most of childhood yelling at him. saying he's a lousy buddy. He never actually showed up to play with me or comfort me. So, I have that equation with Krishna. He's my childhood imaginary buddy. So even if there's a level of affection when I explore or reimagine his stories, it comes from this place of love and affection. And there's absolutely no disrespect intended. At the same time, I don't like to, I was always this contrarian. One of those annoyingly argumentative kids who grew up to be an argumentative adult. So I will always, somebody tells me this story, I'll say, why? Why did he do that? Why did Rama do that? Why did Rama put Sita through the Agni Pariksha? My mother will say, who are you to question Lord Rama? I'll say, of course I'll ask questions. Why did he do that? God or not, it's not okay. So I think it's okay. I think Hindu mythology, Indian mythology is such that it's a living organism which continuously evolves, taking into account the needs of the age. And I feel that that's what helps it survive and thrive. So I'm just part of that tradition again, where I question the parts which I consider problematic. I'm just looking for answers, which, as you know, leads only to more questions. And I love that. I love that it's a quest that never ends.
Yeah, I think you've really put that so well. I'm just in sort of being in coexistence with you. I'm looking at it from also a universal aspect, not just as an Indian epic. For me, taking on Indian epics, the epics as a form are universally about the human condition. And when you enter that zone, I really have an argument about what is sacred and what is profane. For a writer, for a storyteller, the imagination is a sacred space because it radiates something that touches everybody's life and sharing. So I remember there was a wonderful thing that Peter Brook, the theatre director, mentioned when he was making the Mahabharata. And he came to India and he would he would never call them actors, the people in his company. They were performers as of Bahurupi. In the last discussion, we were talking about Bahurupi. And he would make them watch intently in whether he took them to an Indian forest or a small village or a rural place. He would say, just watch the way people are talking to that tree or circumambulating a stone. And he always had this thing that in a way everything is sacred, whatever we create. And it's not, I'm just giving him as a Western perspective and how we also think from other parts of the world. And so it's really about, once you enter that space, there is nothing that's really secular, or even secular is sacred. Because the act of creating something, you have to be focused, you have to be concentrated. And when you are arguing with the gods, it is out of a love and being familiar with them. So, for example, in Ramayana, when the person is ferrying them across, it's the familiarity with Rama that he can so-called curse him. It's like a family quarrel. You become part of a sangha. And it's that kind of responsibility, I think we as writers and storytellers, that's the relationship we build. And again, that's a universal, an epic is a universal thing. It's about the human condition. And again, what is wonderful that keeps being signaled in Indian mythology and the epics, and thanks to a lot of 19th century thinkers, mystics, they keep talking that inside you is the divine and the demonic. And all our theatre art forms are about that wonderful play between what's divine as potential and what's demonic. And how do we play with that conflict? The whole opening of the Natya Shastra is that. So, these evolving of these tales, as you say, and the evolving of us through historical and possibly linear time, it's opening platforms in each moment of history, whether it's colonial, whether it's post-colonial, whether it's 21st century, whether it's post-industrial, whether it's AI, We are vehicles at a time when we are taking in all the frequencies of our current moment and transposing it into these stories, into a language that we share with our readers.
Great. So to extend the idea that you just shared of the stories speaking to the audiences of today, that this is a universal story, but I'd like to ask a slightly contrary question here. Some of your characters, for example, the book The Living Legend has a Rama who feels deeply, right? And in your story also, Anuja, the wife and the dancing girl, there are two women who fall in love intensely with one person. So there is an intensity in these books which may not be so evident in today's life. I mean, people are trying to numb themselves with internet, with scrolling. This is a question I asked another panelist yesterday. You know, there is so much of numbing and trying to forget what people are going through in today's age. How do you think they'd find these stories resonant with what they are going through?
Anjali, it's true. I think most of us officially have ADHD now, and we are definitely grappling with a gadget addiction situation. I mean, you can't even yell at the kids because you're worse than them on many levels. You confiscate their gadgets, but nobody's confiscating yours. So yes, it's all there. We're trying to not feel as intensely. It's all there, but I think it's there. It's a paradox. I said it's not there, and yet it's there. But that's the whole point of it. Here, in The Wife and the Dancing Girl, the whole idea I had for this book is, one, I grew up hearing this story. And make no mistake, it's Kannagi's story. The Silappatikaram is about the power of chastity. And naturally, I mentioned I'm a contrarian. So for me, she's too hard an act to follow. A goddess, a patni, who has been placed on this pedestal. And young girls are told to emulate this girl, this Kannagi. You are told that no matter what crap your husband pulls, your job is to be the devoted, unquestioning, silently suffering, always loving wife. Of course, that's not going to fly with me. Who's going to be like that, right? So it started with me questioning Kannagi. Why? You just know that ancient incels, hand down this version of myth where these impossibly perfect women are there on one hand. So you celebrate chastity to ridiculous levels, although I will say that enforced chastity has zero value. And on the other hand, you excoriate the dancing girl. You call her the loose woman. So you have this very problematic binary where you insist on judging a woman as either the wife, the goddess, or the whore. And men feel free, not just men, women do it too. So you feel free to be the judge, jury, executioner based on these extremely unrealistic set of expectations that are handed down generation after generation. And in Kannagi, another problematic part of the text, which I personally got offended with. Offend is a strong word. I just reacted strongly to it. So growing up, they tell you a very sanitized version. They say when Kannagi's husband was unfairly executed, she won justice for him, proved his innocence, and turned Madurai to ash by the power of her chastity. But when you do your research, you realize the story says, the actual text says, that she plucked out her left breast and hurled it at Madurai and burnt it to ash. And I'm sorry, I would love for the breast to be a detachable organ which you can weaponize at will. But I'm sorry, that's not how breasts work. So, you have to, a dude wrote this story. So I felt I wanted to write a more realistic version of the epic, the way I see it. And I wanted to dedicate it to all women out there who are neither wife nor whore or both nor neither. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. To what extent I succeeded, I do not know, but this was the idea when I set about working on this.
I think you definitely got the audience's applause on that one. I think when you say it is and absolutely right, we've got addiction problems with gadgets, concentration levels are so limited. And I think somewhere in the back of our heads, people like us are taking that in. But I think there's a great place for intensity because there is this numbing. There's a wonderful Pink Floyd, this is telling you how old I am, a Pink Floyd lyric which goes on, I think, what was it? I've got comfortable with the numbness of pain. It's something about that. Comfortably numb, you've got it. So we're all sort of going into that kind of, willful amnesia, willful, anesthetizing ourselves. This is why I think it is a time to be intense. And there's something, that's why it's called epic literature, because you have these characters who will fight for the ideal. And I am a great one who loves metaphors because Carnegie's breast is a great metaphor of, it's her left breast, so it's above her heart. And the fact that as a symbol, a poetic symbol, it's flung in an entire kingdom which holds the white umbrella of justice is turned to ashes. I mean, can you imagine what that is symbolically? Similarly, with Rama, I'm placing him at 16. We often forget that. It's very much like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. We used to see brilliant actors in their 30s and 40s playing Romeo and Juliet, but it's actually two teenagers. They're 14. The love is so intense. With Rama, he's 16. And with somebody like Rishi Vashishta, he is actually able to understand what's at stake if he doesn't go into Dandaka forest, if he doesn't kill these demons. What are these demons? They are symbolic of a dystopian world order, an imbalance in what should be normal. And what the epic characters do is actually, while we read them, engage with them, enter an intense moment in ourselves. We realize that it's those ideals that keep a thing alive. The previous panel speaker was talking about the film Pyasa, and I remember that, Gurudutt film by Rahman. And if we didn't have those kind of ideals in the making of India after independence, we would be crushed. And all those songs express that. We as Indians, I think anywhere in the world, we move to that song of the human condition. And that's why there's a great responsibility in writers like us, how we play with that material. I'm looking at a 16-year-old boy who, like many 16-year-old young adults these days, are facing a world where parents are having expectations, teachers are having another expectation, they have another will. And there are wars of all kinds, and they have to make choices. That's Rama. He's having to make choices. And his wife, the woman he marries, is also 16. They are two young people who are going to take over the world. So it's a heightened intensity. We have to remind ourselves. The birth and age and increasing acceleration of technology is relatively small in years. So at this stage, if we can, and I don't think we sit there in front of our laptop saying, this is how I'm going to change the world. No, it's not about that. It's the zones we enter. We want you all to enter it into us. And intensity is a very important thing to be human. I'll just give you this. There's a lovely moment of W.H. Auden, the wonderful English poet who was a pacifist and went to live in America. And he was being interviewed, I think, around the time of World War II, towards the end of it, and the American moderator said, it's all very fine, you write poetry, but what use is it? And he said, yes, it has the greatest use for us to be human, or words to that effect, because the wars will come and wars will go. And what is it that we do in peacetime? But we reflect on those things in returning to become human. And that's what these old stories do. They are timeless.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Now would be a good time to read a passage from your books. Yeah. Just a question, are you all able to hear our panelists? Is it okay?
So, as they say, love stories have splendid beginnings and squalid endings. So, I thought I'll spare you the squalid ending and give you the splendid beginning of a very special love story between Kovalan and Madhavi, the dancing girl. So, this is like their first meeting, it happens there. I fear the sea, but I'm also a little in love with it. I'm jealous of the sea then, he said, and I laughed at him for being so silly, but I was touched too. Don't be, I said reassuringly, laying my head on his shoulder. In response, he placed his head on mine. His hair fell softly over my forehead, and I loved the way it felt. Of all the beautiful moments we shared, this one will always remain my favorite. I love the sea because her mercurial mood swings remind me of my own. I love that she is besotted with the all-encompassing, unchanging vastness of the sky, and he with her reckless, relentless passion. No matter the infinite distance between them, they never stop striving to be together. And somehow, somewhere, over the furthest horizon, they are united, together at last, never to be parted, because they have worked too hard and sacrificed too much to make it into each other's arms. And they lie happily entwined for the rest of time, and all it took was an impossible leap across the endless distance, made possible only by the madness of true love. That's a very sweet way to look at it, he said, nuzzling the top of my head. And even if she doesn't make it all the way up to the sky, she still has the faithful show, doesn't she? But what's a love story if it is not unnecessarily complicated? I remember thinking at the time that our love story hadn't been complicated at all. It was the easiest thing in the world simply because the two of us together made all the sense it was possible to make. Our union always felt effortless and inevitable and right.
It's difficult. It's difficult to read this, and yet it is very easy to read it because you know the characters. But I'm just sharing with you the purpose or what inspired me to write about it. Because I have a brain that is strangely not always functioning in a linear way, two things happened. I was, during a Diwali session in the UK, I was actually, had gone to a prison where I used to work with the inmates, looking at stories, getting them to tell their stories. So being Diwali time, I narrated the first opening of Ramayana, which often was recited to me in Telugu by my Amama, because I was transposing it in English. So you know Valmiki's origins, you know, he was an absolute criminal and a brute. And I was just thinking, I'm saying this story in a prison. How dare I? But I was already in full flow. I told the story, and finally I ended with how Narada gives the mantra to Ratnakar as it was, how he became Valmiki. After that, one of the inmates are the people who are in prison for life sentences. This was a category A male prison. Two of them, one was an Asian and another one was an African Caribbean. And they both came to me, and one of them had tears in their eyes. And he said, who was to tell us when we were going wrong? These stories help us. This is a lifer. So it's you know, you're not you, you're a vehicle, and some things come your way and it inspires you. The second inspiration was I had this wonderful title called Sage in Residence at Eton College. And when you go into Eton College, It's got walls and walls and walls and panels. It's a highly prestigious institution in England, has been there for many years. But when you come out of the into the courtyard and you see these big black slabs, and there is a roll call of hundreds and hundreds of names, many of them who died in World War I. And you stop to think, they were 15, they were 16, they are facing a battle to save something. Rama is 16. He's facing a battle to face something. And I just thought I'd share with you that particular moment when he has to reckon with something. So it's after the Ashwamedha, Dasharatha has these boys, and I move into, 16 years passed, and now these young men, the four brothers, Rama, Lakshmana, and Shatrughna, thank you. All these four are good brothers, and they've grown strong. At that time, to Dasharatha's court came sage Vishwamitra. Vishwamitra was a Brahma Rishi, the greatest of sages of his time. Sages were known to live and work for 120 or 30 years. At one time, he had been a warrior king and was known as scorcher of foes. Vishwamitra longed for immortality, but he realized after many wars that immortality did not come from defeating his enemies or their death. It came from peace. Peace within his restless body and peace towards nature and people. He gave up his kingship and went to study the nature of peace. Along with some other sages, he set up a hermitage in the Dandaka forest, and there he prayed for the peace and progress of mankind. It was not a passive way of life. It was a dynamic revolution of living in peace by observing behavior and perceiving the beast in man and compassion among animals. Thus, in the hermitage, following a way of studying the mind and how it varies in viewing life under different emotions like fear or joy, they were able to create a science of the self, or yoga, by understanding the fine light that makes us who we are and lives on long after our mortal bodies have ceased to. But in Dandaka, 3 Rakshasa demons, Tataka and her 2 sons, Subahu and Maricha, were polluting the forests. They poured oil into the forest streams, choking fish and other waterborne animals. Much of this was done out of boredom and exercising power through terror. Not only that, they poured the blood and flesh of animals into the sages' sacrificial pyres of sacred grass and bark. So when Vishwamitra walked into the court of Dasharatha, he had come on a very specific mission, to rid the forests of this menace. More than that, he wanted to bring about a renewal of balance in the forces of nature in the forest, because he knew the earth could heal itself. But the intervention needed was to bring a human to rid the forest of terror, and more importantly, to develop a relationship with the environment. In establishing this, there needed to be mutual caring between humans and the environment. Everybody offered him salutations and welcomed him with sandalwood paste and rose water, but he waved them aside and went straight to Dasharatha and said, "I want your son, Rama." Dasharatha knew what the Dandaka forest was like. "Please, why don't you take my armies, chariots, and my best soldiers? All of them are at your command. Rama, as you know, is still a young boy," he pleaded. Vishwamitra could sense the paternal anguish in Dasharatha. He flinched at the show of sentimentality in a king. He realized Dasharatha was not yet ready to test his son for the greater good. Why waste time, he thought, and rose like lightning to leave this court and make other arrangements for the protection of the Dandaka forest. Dasharatha, beleaguered by the sage's request, could not see the consequences of his refusal to send Rama. He had in some way weakened in his word to his people and the earth that the protection of the forests and sages was of high priority. But his chief counselor, Sage Vashishta, could see what this could mean in terms of the welfare of the state. Letting a great warrior sage like Vishwamitra walk away in what seemed like a huff was poor diplomacy and gross discourtesy to intellectualism and the civilized society that Koshala professed to be during Dasharatha's rule. How does one steer the direction of something from tumbling and crashing downwards? Insight and immediate action.
So I'll just ask one last question before I open it to the audience. I'd like you to place your reimaginations of these timeless classics in today's day and age, in today's socio-political context. Yeah, we live in a very polarized society in India right now. At one end of the political spectrum, you have people who misappropriate these classics, these sacred texts for their benefit to further divide society, right? And then there is the group that actually would completely dismiss and would wonder, why are you harking back to texts that led to really problematic and divisive structures like the caste system, right? Like patriarchy, like misogyny. Why are we harking back to those classics, to those texts, which indeed exacerbated an unequal society? So what do you have to say about bringing these classics in today's age in such a polarized atmosphere, and how to interrogate some of these texts without a vested agenda attached to that? Yeah.
On the one hand, it is true that the texts have been, whether it's the Puranas or the Itihasas, they have been wildly misinterpreted and weaponized and shoved down the throats of women and the minorities. But that doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because like I said, these stories are beautiful, and Vayu told us that lovely story about how stories have the power to make a difference, to change lives. We can change the world one story at a time. So there's no need to abandon the stories themselves. You kind of acknowledge, yes, some parts of it are problematic, and you initiate a dialogue. Even with the Ramayana, I'll agree that it was something, one of the controversial aspects of the Ramayana would be the Agni Pariksha. And there are real-world ramifications to something like that. Vayu pointed out that these are intense philosophical treatises which signify more than what is just being said. There is symbolic, ritualistic, spiritual depth and layers and meaning to it. But the stories themselves are for the consumption of the common man. So sometimes nuance gets sacrificed in the telling of it, which is why something like this is misunderstood. You say, see, the onus of proving your purity rests on the woman's shoulders. And then you have something like Sati, you have Johar. The Ramayana tells us Sita was spared the wrath of Agni. But in real life, whether you're good, bad, ugly, pure, impure, man, woman, child, fire does not discriminate. And you had practices like Sati and Johar. And even today, it's not like you can say all these happened years ago, why are you talking about it now? Read the newspaper, somebody dowry harassment case, the woman is burnt alive on the altar of male pride. So these are things which you challenge, and because activists did bring about change, we did abolish Johar and Sati. So the way I see it, the past cannot be discarded entirely whether you want to or not. It's there in your life, and it can be used to negotiate the terrain of the present and to forge a path into the future which has more of your strengths and hopefully less of your weaknesses. That's how I look at it.
I think that's so articulately put. It's really got the finger on the pulse. I also look at these stories, these epics, these characters in it. They're a platform of ideas, and they always have been. I mean, there's no one Ramayana. There are 15 literary versions. There are 1,009, colloquial versions, and then it has spread all the way to Sumatra, to Java, to Philippines, and they have their interpretation. What all the more it says is, no epic can be or should be politically vandalized for its causes. This is the beauty about the form of epic and the classics. They are talking about the human condition. And I remember when we were discussing love, love is messy. Through war, you encounter love. You know, these are the human things that happen. We are a global society, and all the more now because these forms and stories are available in different forms through animation, through books, through comics. I remember Amar Chitrakatha was very much my generation of also, gaining insight into stories of Savitri and Satyavan. But what we mustn't lose in these stories is the symbolism. We have become too literal. That's why we have this. If it's, Sita is going to be burned, that means we have to really burn them. No. But they have also been spaces for a discussion, for ideas and activism where things are stopped, And if we get rid of this, what is the core that holds us? I mean, when you think of the wisdom of the ancients or just the common folk, the orality of storytelling kept it alive all across the subcontinent. And those days, subcontinent was from what is now Kandahar, which would have been Gandhara, right up to what is now Myanmar, right up to Lanka. So through the oral telling, through those storytellers, Sutradhars traveling all across, the stories are being told. So you have Tulsi Ramayana where Sita is walking between Rama and Lakshmana, but behind Rama. But in Valmiki's time, she's walking in front of him. These are subtle nuances of historical linear times, but also the status and position of women. Unless we listen, we hear, we read, we examine, how can we contest the things of the past, the things of the present? Sometimes through ignorance, people call that tradition, but it's baggage. And that baggage has to be re-examined to throw out what has been so antithetical to human, nature and kindness. And I think this is why it's so important to be intense, to be focused. Again, the whole perception of Indic philosophy is Shravana Manana Nidhyasana. You listen, you reflect, and then you make it a passage of entering your life and acting thus. How can we throw that away? That's incredible. Okay.
Great. Now I invite questions from the audience. Would you want to ask? Yes, please. Your name, please.
First of all, I would like to thank both of you from the corner of my heart. It's really amazing to hear these perspectives, which were really novel to me. So I have done my PhD, but I remember while I was selecting my topic for PhD, I was very much fascinated by these mythical narratives, and especially Ramayana and Mahabharata. But my supervisor stopped me for taking this topic. I was selecting representation of sexuality in Mahabharata. So he stopped me from the perspective कि 5 साल में करना है कि if you want to just lie down for 10-15 years. It's a vast universe and there are multiple narratives where you will be stuck and you should focus on getting your degree and then rest of life you have to do research. But right now I was just getting those flashbacks while I was doing my primary research. First question, ma'am, I have is just like you mentioned that from beginning, from our early childhood, we have these narratives floating in our veins through nook and corner. And we revolt that why this, why that. What counter we get till date is that you won't understand because they have these versions that they are avatars, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, Kali Yuga, and these gods are just incarnating, right? And that's how Sita was not the human body. Ram was not the real Rama. He was incarnation of Vishnu. And Sita didn't let it go into the fire. Likewise, Urmila, two character which attracted me most was Urmila, Lakshman's wife, and Supernakha. Urmila didn't sleep for 14 years. And she was left behind by her husband that you have to take care of my parents. And Supernakha, Lakshman's sister, Ravana's sister, she vocalized.
Is there a question? Because
Yeah,
others,
yeah, ma'am, just my question is, how do you counter that narrative which is presented that these stories have a legit strong support system of being goddesses? As you mentioned that they are real life characters, 16 years, and they are dosed with these decision making process. However, all these narratives have a counter that they are reincarnation of goddess. So whatever they are doing, they are non-humane. They are some magic and some supernatural elements they have. That's why they are facing these things. If I have put across.
To put it very simply, you can look at it at many levels. Gods, goddesses, there's a story, there's a backstory, and the backstory has a backstory. The way I see it, it's all cause and effect, and it's all interconnected in very unique ways. We'll just take Surpanaka alone. There's a very she's punished for her desire. What was viewed as illicit by Lakshmana because she's attracted to a married man, it wasn't illicit in Surpanaka's world. It wasn't the Rakshasi way. They were well within their rights to take as many partners as they pleased whenever they wished. So it's just another way of life, and the epic makes it clear that she was merely a catalyst to trigger the greater design of destiny, which is usually oblique to us mere mortals. Who are we to judge? So Surpanaka isn't a villain here. She's not the bad guy. And to prove that, in the Mahabharata, you have a story where they say she was reborn as Kubja because her desire was frustrated. And Kubja was hunchbacked with all that baggage, I'm guessing, literally. So when Krishna showed up in Mathura to wrestle with Kamsa, none dared to perform the Arati. And Kubja alone made her way over, and they say when she took the Arati, her spine straightened, and she became Krishna's lover, and her desire was fulfilled in another life. So that's how it is. There's a certain beautiful, it's the circle of life, like from the Lion King. So what goes around comes around, round and round we go.
So let me take it in another related way. And that's the primary hook of my book, that everything is connected. These demons, these divine devis. So what am I saying in the Ramayana? And now there is also evidence through botany, through biology, that in a way it was brought to my attention by the Maori. I volunteer in a botanical garden. And I did do a sort of a tour of the history of plants and medicines. And the Maori thinking was that we as humans are actually descendants of plants. And of course, because we're all so sophisticated and modern, and we think that's rubbish. But actually, now with modern biological microscopic evidence, and this really came to light in the 19th century with the study of ferns, that every being has a cell structure. Us, monkeys, bears, plants, everything. From that cell, what is similar in it, in all these beings, is the mitochondria, which is the storehouse of energy from the cell, which connects with all the other cells in the body and gives it the energy and its functioning. Now, if in a very sophisticated human being, there is that cell, in the monkeys, in Hanuman, there is a cell, in the bears, in the squirrel who are building the bridge to Lanka, there's that cell. Even Shurpanakha has that cell. The great philosophical question is, we are all, even Ravana is a kind of an avatar, and there is a greater purpose that Anubhav makes us realize. But we have to understand how to listen to these stories. That's what we're trying to say. Let us not forget how you listen to these stories. Yes, your supervisor was correct. You can think about these things, but you started at the right point in your PhD by asking those questions. When I say we have to understand how to listen to these stories, let us not get lost in the literality. That is not the real thing. Sanskrit is an amazing language, if many of these were written in Sanskrit, but it's also a connotational and a contextual language. It is a poetic language. It is constantly making references according to a context. So how we listen informs how we understand. Okay?
Do we have one more question? Can we take just one more question? Yeah, just one more question if anybody has a question. I see that. Okay. So could I ask the both of you just one last question? How have these works impacted you? How have they influenced you? How have these characters, sort of influenced your personal lives since you've been writing about them for such a long time? Yeah.
It's an eternal love affair, and it's exciting and fresh, and it evolves every step of the way. And I'm so grateful for the stories that fuel and sustain me in so many ways, which I can't even describe with anything close to coherence. It just has to be experienced, and I'm grateful for this beautiful, immersive gift that I've inherited.
I think very similar to that. One is just filled with gratitude. When I used to train as a storyteller with the Bowls of Bengal, Samrat Purnadas, he'll always tell me, in Bangla they have this thing that you are actually an empty vessel. And when a story is poured in, then you understand its significance. But the vessel has to be empty. That means you have to be open to receive. And that's the kind of a gratitude. I'm also very grateful to my husband who's come all the way to be with me, Chris Banfield. And we, in fact, we met through the Ramayana. But that's another story I won't share with you now. The important thing from how it's had an impact on my personal life is that we have, you really see how these epics are universal. It has been used, the fight against might for right. And we have seen it, with England, with India, but it's also the bridge of harmony, So I get those Western perspectives, which are very important. And all the more I feel the impact on my life is the epics are universal. Yes, they originate in a place, but it is universal because it is about humanity.
Thank you so much. To end on that beautiful note, thank you for coming here. Yes.
Thank you so much, Anjali, Vayu, and Anuja. The classics. I was saying this to Anuja in the morning session. I'm a classist myself. I don't write it, but I love reading, mythology. And I feel it's coded into our DNA. It's coded into our DNA. And for me, it's a point of reflection and a mirror of, those times. And it's really important, what is it that we need to take forward and what is it that we need to leave behind. All right. Thank you all so much.